Greetings. I hope this finds you well. And I just wanted to go over a very important email that I received from a Christian who says, quote, "I keep seeing these claims that Jesus is fake." And he cited a bunch of different claims. And so what I thought I would do today to respond to him was I would go through each of his claims and hopefully be able to settle some of the issues that are going on in his mind, because there are wolves out there. There are wolves out there in sheep's clothing, but there are also just plain wolves out there these days engaged in a spiritual battle. We're not just up against flesh and blood. We're, of course, engaged in a spiritual battle, and that's been going on for a long time in the Christian church and even going on prior to that. And so without further ado, we'll start off a little bit today by going into the email to see exactly what this person was dealing with. And I think that he might have sent his email to other people besides myself, because it was interesting. He sent a quote, and I tried to find where the quote came from, which I was unable to find, unfortunately, in the short time where I had to look at this email. But he sent a quote, and when I put the quote onto the internet, I found out that someone else had already responded to a few of the items in this email. And so I will touch on some of that, but I will also present some other answers to many of these questions, because we are dealing with a difficult time right now. And so let's take a look at these slides. And before we do that, though, I want to read a little quote that brought me back to Christianity. And it's from C.S. Lewis. And he said in his book, Mere Christianity, "A man who was merely a man and said the sorts of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on a level with a man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool. You can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to." When I was kind of a flailing Christian in my 30s, I had thought that Jesus was merely a great moral teacher, and I really hadn't looked into the evidence for his resurrection. Once I did look into that evidence, and I found that there were no less than 42 sources, including 33 Christian sources and 9 people who were non-believers back within 150 years of Jesus' resurrection, who had attested to various components of the New Testament, I felt much more assured in my Christian faith. Also, more recently, when I found the information with respect to the Shroud of Turin and a lot of the recent academic studies far after the 1988 carbon dating of a corner of the shroud, a teeny corner of the shroud that possibly had some woven fixes in the medieval times. Once I went past that and we started looking into another of other tests with respect to Jesus, I think that that is the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. And I think that gives us an additional source of confidence and information with respect to Jesus. And so let's take a look at, I'm going to go through this line by line to make some responses. Okay, so here we go. Let's take a look at the next slide. Here's what he said. Now, I'm not quoting his name because he didn't give me permission, and I just figured it'd be probably nicer if I just say that this is what he said. So he says, "I keep seeing these claims that Jesus is fake, that the Christian writings that mention Jesus are forgeries by Christians like Josephus and Tacitus." Now, let me stop there really quickly. Josephus is a Jewish historian, and he had sided up with the Romans and written a history of he basically wrote a history of the Jewish faith, and he included a couple of mentions of Jesus in that. And he was born around 38 AD, again, about 5 years after Jesus' resurrection, and he lived till about 100 AD. So we know that Josephus must have written what he did during the time when many people were alive who could attest to the Christian faith and to what the claims are of Christianity. Now, Tacitus, he was a Roman historian, and he was also, like Josephus, a non-believer in Christianity. And what Tacitus did was he wrote about what happened under Nero. Now, Nero was the emperor of Rome around 66 to 70 AD. Nero was an evil man, And Nero wanted to pin the blame on the Christians for a fire in Rome. And he apparently rode around on his chariot, and he did a lot of terrible things. And then he said that Jesus, or Christus, paid the ultimate price. And of course, if you knew what that meant, the ultimate price during the Roman Empire meant that you were crucified, because that was the worst form of torture that you could endure. The crucifixion was perfected by the Romans. It had been developed by the Persians. But interestingly enough, it was also alluded to in the Old Testament hundreds of years before the Persians had even invented it. So if you go back to Psalm 22, you're going to see that the person mentioned in Psalm 22, whose clothes were divided up by the bulls of Bashan, who encircled him, a crowd had encircled him. Of course, that was when Jesus was on the cross, and they pierced his hands and his feet, mentioned in Psalm 22, written about 1,000 years before Jesus walked the earth. Also Isaiah 53, he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Now, Isaiah was written during the time of the Assyrian captivity around the 8th century before Christ. So around over 700 years before Christ had even walked the earth, it said he was pierced for our transgressions. And then if you go to Zechariah 12:10, you'll also see a mention about the firstborn being pierced. And so we have lots of mentions that kind of allude to the crucifixion mentioned hundreds of years before. Now, the thing is you realize that if there are prophecies that have been fulfilled, there are certain divine implications of these prophecies. So that is some of the exciting stuff about the Judeo-Christian faith. So let's continue. So he says, Josephus and Tacitus, and that the historians, and by the way, the person who wrote this wrote a tremendous run-on letter. I tried to take quotes of this, finding periods, but I couldn't find any. So we're just going to get into this run-on sentence. So here we go. What Christians believed about Jesus, which is why they can't be used as evidence that Jesus existed, since they were only recording what Christians believed, or that the historians who wrote about Jesus never existed. Okay. So what he's saying is the historians recorded what the Christians believed. But let's remember the historians were contemporaries to people who lived during that time. Let's put that into context. Let's put it into context for, say, Josephus wrote his works around 70 AD, which is my understanding of about when he wrote the works. Now, if we want to compare that to some event that occurred during our time, we say 33 AD was when Jesus was crucified. Some people say 30, whatever, either 30, 33. I believe 33 is pretty well attested. But anyway, so say we go 40 years after that. So if we compare that to, say, 1973, but say we pick an event that occurred during our century so we can compare it in our own minds. So if I were to pick something that occurred 40 years ago, right now we're in 2024. So if I were to go back to 1984, and look at events then, certainly I can find some people, including myself, who lived in 1984, who could attest to a variety of events that occurred back then. If I wanted to talk about, say, JFK's assassination in the year 1963, and I found people who were living in 2003, 40 years after, certainly I could find some people who could attest to that. So it didn't matter that they believed it. I could also, if I'm writing a history, I couldn't get away with writing a false history when all of these people around me could call me out for it. Okay, so even if they are just saying, I'm just writing what they believed, even if Josephus and Tacitus didn't take on those beliefs, of course they're recording what other people believed, what they said, what they thought is true, because that's what you do as an historian. So let's go to the next one. Okay. Okay, so here we go. Jesus never existed. Now, let's remember that Jesus also, because of Jesus, we've got the split in time before Christ and Anno Domini after Christ. And so we've got a split in time. Clearly, the man who was born in an obscure little area in Galilee has changed the world for the better, and we even split time over him. So certainly he has existed. Now, some Jesus mythicists claim that there was a man who existed. However, we attributed a lot of miracles to him. And that's also a belief that Jewish people feel, and Muslims, and also people who are in the Hindu faith. They also believe that there is a man who existed during that time. All of these other faiths never deny that Jesus existed. They just don't attribute the miracles and the resurrection to Jesus. So as a Christian, what do we do to affirm the New Testament and to affirm our beliefs? Well, we really have to look into the validity of the New Testament and the validity of the resurrection. And so as we go through these slides, I'm going to encourage you to take a look at some of the areas that I've looked at that have offered me some solace and some peace towards whether or not Christianity is true. And that means, in other words, whether or not Jesus resurrected, because that's the foundation of Christianity. So let's get into the next thing. There were no eyewitness accounts. Okay, so some people have claimed that there were no eyewitness accounts to Jesus. Now, they discount the New Testament. They don't believe anything in the New Testament, and they insist that we find stuff outside of the New Testament. And I feel that that's rather unreasonable. We have the New Testament writers. We have Matthew, who is a tax collector, who was one of the apostles. Clearly, he was an eyewitness. We have Mark, who was a very good friend of Peter. John Mark, he's known as. He also traveled in the book of Acts, and he was referenced in the epistles. So John Mark was a friend of Peter. He also traveled with Paul, and Paul came to appreciate him in his ministry. And so we've got people who were either traveling with eyewitnesses or were eyewitnesses themselves. It's unclear whether or not John Mark was able himself to see Jesus, but we do know that Matthew was. Then we get to Luke. Luke was the physician who traveled with Paul. In fact, you can see when he starts writing his book of Acts, he refers to himself in the first person, starting around the middle of the book of Acts, around Acts 16. And he refers to his travels with Paul. And so Luke and Paul had also many interactions with Peter and the other apostles. And so Luke was able to recount that. Luke spent a lot of time recounting what happened in the New Testament, in his book of Luke and also in the book of Acts. And he went back, as he said, to Theophilus, and he talked to many people to try to put together the entire story of what happened. In fact, many believe that he talked to Mother Mary to talk about the birth account. So Mother Mary recounted it, and she said she held all these things and treasured them up in her heart. That's evidence of such a very personal message that Mary gave to Luke. And John, of course, is the Apostle John. And we can give confidence that John is the Apostle John because of not only the fact that he refers to himself as the beloved disciple, but that this is also affirmed in the books of, say, Ignatius of Antioch. It's also been affirmed because John was the one to whom Jesus gave the care of his mother, Mother Mary, to John, and that's mentioned in the book of John specifically. It's also the fact that John was a fisherman, and he uniquely talked about that we found 153 fish after Jesus had been crucified and had reappeared to the apostles at the sea. They found 153 fish, and of course, a fisherman would count those fish. That's what they would do. Now, what about the references to the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? We have plenty of, first place, this comes from the early church, so it goes back in history. We don't have any references to anyone else other than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So the people who claim that this stuff is anonymous, they have no replacement. They just say, oh, it's anonymous. We can't take the names that were affirmed by people like Papias, also by Clement of Rome, by Irenaeus in the 1st and 2nd century. We can't take any of that stuff as credible. They won't go back to Justin Martyr. They won't go back to all of the other people who also affirmed Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as the unique authors of the Gospels to whom these books have been attributed. So tell these people who say that it's not Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that it's anonymous. Well, find us evidence where someone says anywhere in the 1st, 2nd, or 3rd century that these books are anonymously written, and you won't find that. So we've gotten rid of that little problem, because we have many quotes by them in the earlier church fathers prior to the mid-2nd century, and none of them have any names attributed to them. That's actually completely patently false. Again, like I mentioned, Papias, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, again, going back to the 2nd century. We've also got Clement of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch, and others who have quoted them. And so there's lots of stuff that we have that gives evidence to them, okay? So let's see what it says. Paul either never existed or he never saw Jesus. Now, interestingly, I put this passage up on my Twitter or my X account, and I asked people, and I copied Godless Engineer, because Godless Engineer is about to be referenced here. And I had another woman called Godless Grandma or Granny, Godless Granny. She responded to this and she said, this is completely untrue. People who are non-believers do not say that Paul never existed. Godless Engineer did not say that Paul never existed. And so I've actually never heard anyone aside from this writer say that Paul never existed. And so I feel kind of badly for people who will take that incredible stretch, because even the biggest Jesus mythicists like Richard Carrier admit that Paul existed. So who is Paul? Well, in the book of Acts, Paul tells his story several times. Luke recounts Paul's story several times, where Paul was a person who was called Saul. He was completely against the way, which is the Christians, and he was a zealous Jew. He had been trained under Gamaliel, and Gamaliel was really well known Pharisee, really well known, really well respected Pharisee, and Paul had been trained under him, as he reported himself. Paul was at the foot of St. Stephen, the first Christian martyr. St. Stephen was an amazing martyr, and he stood up for all of the accounts, and he blended in the Old Testament with the New Testament in his testimony. And unfortunately, that really ignited fury in some of the Jewish people of his time, who decided that he needed to be stoned. And so Paul, or Saul, was at the foot of St. Stephen when he was stoned. Now, St. Stephen looked into the heavens and he saw Jesus, and he asked Jesus and the Lord to have mercy on the people who were stoning him. What a tremendous testimony in itself. So Paul got his papers, he went off, he was on his way to Damascus. He was saying very hateful things because he thought that the way was sort of a real heretical view of Judaism. He was furious about it. And as he was going down the road, Jesus suddenly appeared to him. He said, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And Saul said, who are you, Lord? I am Jesus, who you are persecuting. Now go ahead and I will call on what you need to do. Now Jesus didn't give him a choice. Saul had been blinded for a few days, and Ananias appeared to him as instructed. Something like scales fell off of Paul's eyes. He ended up writing around 13 books of the New Testament. Some have contested that, a few of those, but I would say 13 books of the New Testament have attributed to Paul. And he is arguably one of the strongest, most ardent apostles of Jesus, even though, as he said, he was one abnormally born. In 1 Corinthians 15, he talks about that whole testimony about how Jesus and the message of Jesus came down, first to Peter, then to the 12, then to James, Jesus's relative, and then to Paul, the one abnormally born. And so he passed that whole message on. So Paul, again, very big believer until he ended up being beheaded. He was a Roman citizen, so he was not going to be crucified. That wasn't something that was given to the Roman citizens. But under Nero, he was beheaded around the 70s, or actually the 60s, and just was like Peter. Peter was also, unfortunately, martyred. He was crucified upside down, according to tradition, under Nero. And so that's the fate of what happens to believers. Now, I have asked many atheists to say, please explain to me why people who were uniquely in a position to know the truth, they were uniquely positioned to know the truth, yet, and they would die for it. Why is that? Like, how can you explain these people's actions? They were eyewitnesses. They knew eyewitnesses. They were willing to stand up for Jesus despite really gruely and grisly deaths. Why is that? What is your explanation for the way they were? And they try to say, oh, well, there's people today who are Muslims who are willing to be martyred. They're willing to kill themselves, to kill other people around them. That's a completely unequal relationship, because the Muslims don't say that they saw Allah. There's no vision of, say, Muhammad coming to them and telling them to do anything. There's nothing. It's totally non-related. So they're comparing apples to oranges, sadly. So anyway, we got the idea that Paul did exist, and he wrote about Jesus in the 1st century. Okay. And so every other author wrote about him in the 2nd century. Now that is something that I haven't heard really. I mean, it must be an extremist that says that every other author wrote about him in the 2nd century. Now let's clarify for people, because some people get confused when you say 1st century or 2nd century. 1st century means the year 1 AD to 99 AD. 2nd century goes to 100 AD to 199 AD. And so the second century authors, possibly in the early part of the second century, would have known some of the people who had countered Jesus or Jesus's followers, certainly. And so, sure, we had some writers coming from the second century, like Justin Martyr and Papias and Irenaeus, but we also had plenty of writers in the first century. Not only the gospel authors, obviously Peter, who wrote his book in the New Testament. We also have the gospel authors, and we also have Paul, who, if he's died around, say, 64, 66 AD, clearly he had to write his stuff before that. Now, if we go to the book of Luke and the book of Acts, people believe that Matthew and Mark, or Mark and Matthew, were the two that preceded the book of Luke. If that's the case, then we have to look at the book of Luke and the book of Acts to try to date those. Now, in the book of Acts, the stars are Peter and Paul, right? Peter and Paul are the stars, arguably. Tell me somebody else is a star of the book of Acts besides Peter and Paul. However, Peter and Paul's martyrdoms, and Luke would be very privy to when Paul was martyred because he was traveling with Paul, and he was with Paul in Rome when Paul was martyred. Why didn't Luke write about that? Well, it's and he did write about, it's not like he didn't write about martyrdoms. He wrote about the martyrdom of Stephen and the martyrdom of James, the son of Zebedee, in the book of Acts. So why didn't he include the martyrdoms that occurred in the 60s, if only that he possibly dated and finished the book of Acts prior to the martyrdoms of Peter and Paul? Quite likely. So we're talking now prior to the fall of the Jerusalem temple in the year 70. Ask any person who dates all of the Gospels after 70 what the foundation, what their assumption is that is led to that dating. And in a PhD program or a DBA program, you're going to know that when people have a theory, you have to ask what their underlying assumptions are. The underlying assumption in the dating from agnostics, non-believers, people who say that all of the Gospels had to be written after the year 70. The underlying assumption is that Jesus could not have possibly known that the temple was going to fall because he died in 33 and the temple fell in 70. So therefore, everything that was written must have been written after people were aware of the temple falling. And then they attributed that to Jesus saying that the temple was going to fall. In other words, they don't believe in prophecies because they understand the divine implications. The exact same assumptions guide people who try to date Daniel much later than Daniel's actually written. Daniel was written in the 6th century BC, as Daniel himself attested. And also we've got support from Jesus, Joseph, and in the other books of the New Testament to Daniel and the earlier dating around the time of King Nebuchadnezzar. But I digress. What I'm trying to point out here is that a lot of times people, when they're doing their dating of these different books, are basing it on assumptions that there can't possibly be fulfilled prophecies. Therefore, we must put the writer after the prophecy occurred. You see what I'm saying? So that is a faulty, unfortunate thing that happens. Now, here's what else we say. That they wouldn't die for a lie argument is premised on apostolic martyrdoms, which were legends that emerged centuries after Jesus lived and died and contradict one another by attributing different horrific martyrdoms to the same apostle. Okay, so let's get into this one with martyrdoms. I think a pretty reasonable person that you guys can go to who did his dissertation on martyrdoms is called Sean McDowell. Now, some would say, oh no, Sean's a Christian, we can't count that. Why? Like, why can't we count the testimonies of Christians? Especially saying, okay, why can't we count the testimonies of the early church fathers? Merely because they're Christians, we're going to discount that? Merely because they found the testimonies very compelling, so they converted to Christianity, we're going to discount what they said? Because they're being honest with the evidence, we're not going to count their writings? How reasonable is that? Now, Sean did his dissertation on this. I saw him in a debate with Apologia. Apologia, who is a pretty famous atheistic YouTuber, also agreed that Peter and Paul, as Sean found, was very compelling arguments for the martyrdoms of Peter and Paul in the early church writings. Apologia agreed with that. And so others have too. And so I haven't seen anybody say there were no apostolic martyrdoms and they all emerged as legends centuries later. That's just not even looking into anything that the early church fathers said. Aside from the fact, of course, we've got recordings of Stephen and James, we also have recordings by Josephus, contemporary, who talked about Jesus's relative, a different James. Okay, so we also have that reference from Josephus. Again, just to remind you, he was born around 38 and he lived till 100. And he referenced that particular martyrdom. Peter and Paul's martyrdoms have been referenced by the early church fathers. Eusebius, around 325, documented much of this. And so we have that. But we also have others, like Irenaeus laid everything out. Ignatius of Antioch, some of you haven't looked into him. He died probably around 108 to 110, but Ignatius also spelled out and duplicated much of what was written into the Gospels and also affirmed many of our traditions. And so, yeah, look into it. Just be open, read the stuff. Go and read the stuff. Read what Justin Martyr said. Read what Papias said. These are very early church fathers and church people, many who died also, like Justin Martyr also was martyred. He says, no one mentions Josephus until 325. That's Eusebius mentioning Josephus, or Tacitus until 116. Okay, who cares? Okay, that's an argument from silence. So we still have Josephus's writings, which many agnostics, non-believers, people of all different faiths have used Josephus as a reference to the ancient Near East. Why is that? They used Josephus to try to figure out exactly when Jesus was born. People use Josephus to trace back many of the events all the way going well into the Old Testament times. And people use Tacitus too to trace a lot of the Roman history. Okay, so it doesn't matter if the ancients didn't say, hey, Josephus said this, when we have references of Josephus and exactly from Josephus's accounts themselves, from against Appian, from his chronicles. We've got a lot of stuff from Josephus ourselves. We don't need to worry if some ancient writer mentioned him. Another thing to mention is how hard it was to retain many Christian documents because they were under emperors who tried to destroy them all. Like just before Constantine came around 313, a little over a decade before that, we had Diocletian, who had taken it upon himself to destroy as many Christian documents, especially anything related to the Gospels, that he could. That's what he wanted to do. Okay, he says here, there is no proof in Roman Senate records that Jesus Christ even existed. Sure. I found online a pretty good commenter. I'm forgetting the person, I can't attribute it to, but he said 99.9% of people who lived during the ancient times were not included in Roman Senate records. Interestingly, if you want non-Christian stuff, though, Jesus is documented in the Talmud. He's documented in Jewish records of that time, which they also documented his death, how he died. Okay, so that's part. That the historic Jesus, for the most part, is studied in the same places by the same people that the Jesus of faith is studied. Seminary schools, Bible colleges, Christian universities, and their critical evaluations, which they claim isn't very critical, is only allowed to go so far, and that the historical sources are mainly theologically motivated texts. Now, this is attributing people's motivations, and also underlying this, perhaps, is this idea that people would be motivated to lie or to stretch the truth. And I think that people don't realize when you're taking these positions about Christianity is how dangerous that would be and what it means to have fear of the Lord. If you've been entrusted to write about the Lord and to recount various situations and to study the Lord as clearly and openly as you can, to do something really deceitful, if you understand what is said in the book of Acts with Ananias and Sapphira, how they were struck dead immediately for trying to lie to the church or lie about the church, that could be something that would be very dangerous. And so he's saying theologians are not historians. Well, theologians could certainly have dual degrees if they wanted. But the idea is, yes, in some places, people are studying Christianity. As he mentioned, seminary schools, Bible colleges. I'm studying Christianity from my home. Many people study Christianity from their homes. You don't need to have a degree in Christian history or in a Bible college or in a seminary school to study Christianity. People have been doing that for thousands of years now. Okay, says, and they may have an interest in ancient history, but that the primary motivation is to protect and preserve Christian theology. Show me evidence where anyone says, my primary motivation is to protect and preserve Christian theology. I don't see it. I haven't seen it. I've been reading about the church fathers for a very long time. And the only thing you'd be protecting Christian theology from is from heresy. And so in the early church, yes, we did have people who were writing about Christianity and documenting our firm beliefs and putting down people like the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed to affirm exactly what we believe. They were constantly fighting against heretics in the first part of the Christian church. Like even if you go back to Jerome, he wrote a book called Event Against Helvidius, who was a heretic. We've got Irenaeus writing a book about Against Heresies. That's the name of his book. Yes, we were preserving our particular parts of the belief so we know what we believe. When you go to church, we have to rehearse either the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed. Why is that? Because we want people to know exactly what we believe. But we're not trying to, what he says here, prop up the historical Jesus. We're not trying to do that. And he says, and the very historicistic scholars who mock the mythicist position. Okay, so what is the mythicist position? I'm actually unsure, because I've even seen people who are what they call Christian mythicists or Jesus mythicists, like Richard Carrier, who gives some sort of a probability that Jesus existed. So I'm not sure exactly what these people's position is. Do they think that Jesus is a composite? He's a figure where we put a bunch of information together on him? Well, one of the things that you guys can have confidence in is the fact that there are more copies and more evidence of the ancient belief system of Christianity than any other belief system like it. And Josephus' passage in Antiquities 18.3.3 is a forgery. Now, Josephus did write, there is a couple of mentions of Jesus, and one, it looks like there is a Christian who took a few liberties with it, and that's actually pretty unfortunate. But it doesn't, because there's a few Christians that took a few liberties with one passage in Josephus, does not mean that we write off everything else that Josephus said. Okay, so that's an issue. Okay, Josephus in their apologetics ever mentioned the passage, and it was first mentioned in the 4th century. So yeah, I'll go ahead and I'll say that, and actually with the person I found online whose website I'm forgetting, but you can, if you type in part of this, you'll see that. Online, a person who responded to this basically said that apparently the Arabs, there was an Arabic version of what Josephus reported that had the version before the Christian had added a little fluff about that particular passage, kind of building Jesus up beyond what Josephus had accepted about Jesus. So Josephus gave a really critical incident type of view of what Jesus was. He gave the facts. Here's the facts. And the person who embellished said something like, he's our Lord, that sort of thing. And yes, Christians do acknowledge that, which is okay. Okay, so we get into that. Let's get to the next one. Okay, now here's a quote he had, and this is the quote that I couldn't find where it came from. But before I go that, I want to see anyone in the chat. I've got Nikki, Stuart Scott, and we have, it's so interesting, the martyrdom fallacy. Again, Stuart and others who've taken a look at that, please go back and read history books. Read a basic history book. In fact, I would recommend, if you think that martyrdom is a fallacy, that the early Christians weren't martyred, go look at any reasonable secular book. I've got one that was written by about 50 different authors all around the globe called The Historical Geography. And it's written by a person called Wawro, W-A-W-R-O, the year's 2008. They document many martyrdoms themselves. Other secular sources have documented that. And so it's not terribly honest to claim there weren't any martyrdoms in the early church and to deny the martyrdoms of even Peter and Paul. Again, go back to even really big atheists like Apologia acknowledged that Peter and Paul were martyred. It's not a big deal to say they were martyred. Okay, so here's what this quote is. And it says, until it had appeared almost word for word in the writings of Sulpicius Severus in the early 5th century, where it is mixed in with other myths. Sulpicius' contemporaries credit him with a skill in the antique hand. He put it to good use in fantasy was his forte. His Life of St. Martin is replete with numerous miracles, including raising of the dead and personal appearances by Jesus and Satan. The answer to that is, so what? Anyone can write a fiction and make up miracles and say stuff like that. The fact is that what we're trying to say as far as early Christianity is not just one man sitting around writing stuff like what we see with Muhammad, one man sitting around writing stuff. Instead, or Joseph Smith, one man sitting around writing stuff. Instead, what we have in the ancient Christian times is we have multiple authors supported by multiple authors, many authors and many people, written in a contemporary way during a time when you have all of the people around you who could discount what you're saying. We don't have letters from anyone saying that, hey, what Paul said here in the First Corinthians is untrue. This whole story about Jesus appearing to Peter, we don't have that. We don't have that. We have lots of attestations, and we also, again, unlike many of these other testimonies or people writing stories in times after that, we also don't have all of these people who had firsthand knowledge, or they were companions of people with firsthand knowledge, who were able to live their lives and die and be willing to die and to go to in front of the chambers, have their heads cut off, or to be skinned alive or burned alive or threw into a pot of oil, or many other things that could have occurred. We don't have these kind of people who did this stuff because they feared God and they believed strongly in an afterlife because they had seen the risen Christ. Okay, you got to look at the facts here. They said they saw the risen Christ. They lived their lives accordingly. That's one way that you can determine whether or not their words were true and that we can believe what they said. And he says, then you have YouTubers like Godless Engineer making video replies and reacting to every apologist and debunking, destroying, and discrediting them and saying that they failed to prove him wrong and that their arguments are weak and logical fallacies, or that they were caught lying and more mythicists than Christians in the comment sections of the apologetic videos. When apologists use the sources, they're debunking, destroying, and discrediting. With these claims and people like Kenneth Humphreys, Richard Carrier, and Robert Price promoting these claims, and no one is countering these claims of what is called the Christ myth theory. Well, it's unfortunate that the person who wrote this email to me did not see that I've done many videos. I've done actually dozens of videos that have discounted the Christ myth theory. I've actually written blogs against Richard Carrier specifically. I picked out what Richard Carrier said years ago and wrote blogs at christian-apologist.com. You can go into a little section on the homepage about my responses to atheists, my responses to famous atheists, and also internet atheists. And you can see that I've written many responses to people who believe in this Christ myth theory, that Jesus is merely a myth. Going back to what I said at the outset, the idea of C.S. Lewis, as he said, liar, lunatic, Lord. Well, some people have said, oh, he forgot about legend. Well, what is a legend? A legend is something or someone. There's a couple ways to look at a legend. One is a person could be a legend who's a real person who has become legendary. And we certainly see many heroes of our times who are legendary for some of the amazing things they did. Like I would say that if you look at Maximilian Kolbe and his bravery during World War II, being willing to sacrifice his own life at Auschwitz for the life of another, he's become legendary. He's a real person, and he's also legendary, really wonderful person. Well, I could say Jesus is certainly legendary, but I'm not saying that he is a legend that did not exist. He is a legend, and he's also a person who existed, who walked the planet and who changed the world despite very humble beginnings, without the schooling, without the backdrop, without the help of kings, without the service of an army, all that kind of stuff. He was able to change the world for the better. He was able to change our legal systems so that we value all humans. We're all made in the image of God, okay? Man and woman made in the image of God. Go back to Genesis 1:27, but also in Galatians, neither slave nor Jew, nor Greek, nor Rome. We're all one, male or female. We're all one. We're all given equal rights, equal value, and also equal treatment under the law. That is a Christian and a Jewish deal. That is something that came out of the Bible. And it's a wonderful thing that we've incorporated now into our legal systems. And so Jesus was able to change the way that things were. During the Roman Empire, if you were wealthy, you were given better treatment and a better treatment of the law. Like if you killed somebody and you're wealthy, you would be given maybe a hand slap, versus if you killed someone and you were poor, you were killed yourself. And so there was a different treatment depending on your wealth. Okay. So he says, I really want to see counter evidence disproving these claims and the claims of Godless Engineer, because my faith is being shaken by this. Is what Godless Engineer teaches in his videos and on his website true? No. Okay. Flat out no. What Godless Engineer, his name's John. I've been on his channel before years ago. It seems like a nice guy. Seems like he's got a pretty nice wife. I think her name's KC. She commented on my Twitter also, said that Godless did not support some of the things that this person in this email said that I had posted on Twitter. She said Godless Engineer is not supporting that. I said, and she didn't want me to attribute it, what he said, like, for example, what the person said about Paul, that Paul might not exist. Godless does believe, I think, that Paul did exist. And so, yeah, so I'm certainly not going to try to say that Godless said something that he didn't. This person's attributing some of this stuff to Godless. Godless may or may not have said some of these things. So you need to go back and look at Godless's website to see exactly what he said. But I can say once you get there, you're going to find that Godless Engineer, and I encourage you to go watch his debate with Inspiring Philosophy, Michael Jones. I think it was a highly entertaining debate. But and that's on, I think that was on the Non Sequitur channel years ago. Really good debate. But anyway, so Godless Engineer is unfortunately fallen under the spell of Richard Carrier and the mythicist idea. And unfortunately, let's just pray for him to come back. It says, can you help me prove that okay, now this is in this particular slide. I'm not going to get into this because everything that he's saying here is pretty much a repeat of what we had discussed before. But again, he's got just a summary of the whole thing, and he wants to know if it's true, if Jesus is real. And so I've mentioned historical support for Jesus. And I could also mention contemporary, during this time right now, support for Jesus. And let me give you a few examples. And so I also want to say hi to Nikki. She looks like Nikki had to go, but I want to give you a few examples of contemporary support for Jesus. There's a woman whose name is Barbara Comiskey Snyder. And this has also been reported in Lee Strobel's book, Miracles, but it's a woman who's alive today. She's married to a pastor. But in the early 1980s, she lived up in the Illinois area. She was in the Midwest, and she was suffering with multiple sclerosis. And she was bedridden. She could barely breathe. Her lungs were collapsing. She was kind of blinded. Her feet were crumpled. She couldn't walk. She couldn't really do anything. They had pretty much given her last rites. They thought she wasn't going to be alive. But she had hope. And people were praying for her. In fact, apparently people were praying for her on a radio. So if you think your prayers don't work, think again. People were praying for her on a radio, and a lot of people had a lot in their heart about Barbara Comiskey. They wanted her to have help and the impossible miracle to occur. Well, guess what? All of a sudden in her bed, she hears the words, "My child, get up and walk." This is again around 1981. She got up. Suddenly, her body was unshriveled. She was able to walk, even though she'd been relegated to a wheelchair for a very long time. She ended up going to the church that day, that afternoon. She went down the aisle. People started cheering for her because they knew what happened. They knew that she had been bedridden, and their prayers had been answered. There are many other cases like that. Talk to any Christian and ask a Christian if his or her prayers have never been answered. God answers every single one of our prayers. Might not be the way we want it to be answered necessarily. Maybe we don't understand his intentions and long-term views on what's going to happen to us and why he wants us to go through the struggles we're going through. But he answers every prayer, and he loves every single one of us. He came, he died for all of us. So that is the story with Barbara Comiskey. There are many other stories. Apparently Craig, either Keener or Evans, I'm forgetting which one, put together a big book on miracles that could be interesting to watch or read. I haven't read it yet, but I've heard about it. Could be something to see. But miracles are one evidence. Another evidence is looking at the testimonies of the saints, looking at the miracles of the Marian apparitions, especially the miracles at Lourdes. Again, the Virgin Mary appeared to Bernadette Soubirous at Lourdes, France in 1858 and declared herself the Immaculate Conception. 70 miracles have been confirmed by the church and for very strict protocols afterwards, and confirmed by atheist medical people who were unable to figure out any other cause for any of this kind of stuff. But I'm not going to get so much into the Catholic belief system, even though I'm a very strong Catholic. I will just say that those are something that you want to at least pay a little attention to. Aside from that, take a look at people who, their own testimonies of how they've changed their lives. I'm sure many of you have encountered some Christians who've changed your lives. Now, some of you say, and I'm looking at Stuart Scott here, and I see some people who just don't want to believe, they've got it in their heart that they can't believe there's some sort of a wedge between them and God, and they think that maybe whatever they've done is too bad to come into God's good graces. Think again. Look at Paul. Paul certainly did quite a bit against what God wanted him to do when he was off initially ready to go kill Christians. And God turned him around. God can turn anyone around. He loves every single one of us, and he wants every single one of us to be in heaven with him. And it's our choice, our choice. Now, a lot of people today are talking what they call is going to occur very soon. And when I say very soon, it could be tomorrow, could be 50 years, it could be 1,000 years. But soon, as far as the whole age of everything, the age of the universe, soon could be a very, say 1,000 years in the big grand scheme of things is a pretty puny amount of time. But so here's going to be illumination of conscience, and our eyes going to be open to our own sins in the way that Jesus sees us. And at that point, many people will change their ways. And I pray for all of that and all of you to come to Jesus in that glorious kind of way. So thank you, everybody. I hope you enjoyed today. I hope you, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. Thank you. Bye-bye.